Okay. Thanks, everybody. Just before we start, I just want to draw your attention to the fire escapes. So we've got one here and one where you came in. And we're leaving this one open because it's a little bit warm in here tonight, and hopefully the fans won't disturb you too much either. I think they're quite quiet, so that's okay. Like all good gigs, there's a couple of support acts to get through first. And my name's Ashley Howard, and I'd like to welcome you all to this 9th Emmanuel Cooper Memorial Lecture. And we are thrilled to have Julian Stair deliver this year's talk. I'd like to begin by thanking all the partners who have come together to make this evening possible. They are Emmanuel Cooper's partner, David Horbury, the University for the Creative Arts in Farnham, Felicity Ailiff and the Royal College of Art, the Craft Study Centre, also in Farnham, and finally 318 Ceramics, a charitable organisation dedicated to the education and provision of ceramic activities, again based in Farnham, a world craft town. It's because of Emmanuel's involvement with 318 Ceramics that this lecture programme came about back in 2014. Emmanuel was supportive of the organisation's aims and was a patron of 318 Ceramics. I approached David Horbury to ask about a lecture series in Emmanuel's name. David agreed and we made a start. The first 6 lectures were held at the University of the Creative Arts. 318 worked with the late Professor Simon Olding of the Craft Study Centre to stage these lectures. Keen to build and expand, we then started to work with Felicity at the RCA, and in 2020, David Horbury himself delivered the first lecture here. 318 Ceramics continues to grow and develop, and we are sure Emmanuel would have been excited by recent operations. In-house courses, specialist courses, summer schools continue with momentum. This includes outreach programs, such as work with a local dyslexia organisation. Emmanuel spent a lot of time at the Craft Study Centre and, we are sure he'd have been interested in some recent funding received to enable a knowledge exchange between the university, the Craft Study Centre and 318 Ceramics. This has included a swapping of teaching, facilities such as kiln firings, etc., and lectures delivered by lecturers and also students as well, students to students. 318 plays host to resident artists Dr. Kim Bagley and Judy DiBiase. In addition, a studio space is provided for a lucky ceramics graduate from the university for a year after graduation. As with similar operations, 318 Ceramics runs on the hard work and dedication, often unpaid, of a core team. In this case, that team is headed up by Kathy Mason. Emmanuel Cooper fully appreciated the efforts made by such groups to further ceramics in the UK, and I'm sure he would have been chuffed too to see how this lecture series has grown over the years. Before I hand over to Dr. Stephen Knott, Director of the Craft Study Centre, to introduce tonight's lecture, I want to acknowledge the memory of Simon Olding, who helped me greatly in getting these lectures off the ground. And I shall now hand over to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you everyone for coming. My name's Stephen Knott, and I'm the director of the Craft Study Centre down in Farnham. Thanks for Ashley to say thank you to all of the support acts. That means that I don't have to, but particular thanks to the Royal College of Art for hosting us and the technical support and the security. It's great to be here again for the Emmanuel Cooper Memorial Lecture. And of course, thanks most to Julian for delivering tonight's lecture and the audience here for coming. I think the audience here gathered and the strength of the audience suggests that there's a vitality to the field of ceramics at present, regardless of the shifting context in which it is taught, studied and written about. So it's great to see you all here. I've just got a couple of slides about the Craft Study Centre, just for those who don't know about it. And as we're not based in London, it's good to let a London audience know about what we do. So we're an accredited museum and a research centre of the University for the Creative Arts, with object collections of about 9,000 objects and 1,060 archive boxes in 4 material areas: ceramics, textiles, calligraphy and lettering, and furniture and wood. And our history stretches back to 1970, when the Craft Study Centre was formed as a charity, as a kind of national collection of British studio craft. At the time when many of the interwar craftspeople of the kind of the 1920s and 30s were coming to the end of their lives, and their collections with kind of discussions about trying to secure it. And we've been at the University for the Creative Arts since 2000, and the university built the purpose-based museum in which we are still in. What we do, we have 2 exhibition programs, one with our permanent collection on the ground floor, and then a temporary exhibition space on the first floor. We have an events program, of which this is part, and we have a research room to facilitate research into ceramics and all the other craft media that is open to anyone with an interest of studying the histories of studio craft and the histories of those 4 material areas and more. We've got a website, and we're a part of the Farnham World Craft Town Partnership, which 318 Ceramics is a part of, which the university is a part of. There's a very kind of vibrant scene of ceramics and of craft in general in Farnham. And we actively acquire with an acquisitions budget each year to add to our collections for the future. And here's just a kind of quick slide of the 4 material areas represented by an object each, including the one Julian Stair work in our collection, which is very, very small, but it's a delight to have alongside the recent acquisition of a wood vessel by Eleanor Lakelin, and 2 kind of more historic pieces either side. And we have this active exhibitions program. So at the present, we have Maiko Satsumi and Bridget Harvey responding to themes of repair in the collection and in their own practice. So they've been given access to the collection to see the breakages, the chips within the archive, within the collections, and to present that alongside their own work. And this includes a project to repair a Lucy Ree bowl that was found in shards, which you see there on the promotional poster on the left, where they've left it in a state of impermanence with using kind of tape. So they've kind of left it halfway through. So the whole exhibition is about repair. Please do come down, and we're very excited that at this very moment the ceramic artist Ranti Bam is travelling to Farnham to begin a 10-day residency at the Craft Study Centre and the University for the Creative Arts in the ceramics and glass workshop. So she's going to respond to the collections and then make a work. And this was the result of a successful application to the Contemporary Art Society Griffin Award last year. And it gives me extra special, it's a very good news for us, and the future of the Emmanuel Cooper Lecture is an announcement for you today. And that is, over recent months, we have been in conversation with the newly formed charity, States Ceramics, founded with the purpose of promoting scholarship, research, and debate surrounding studio ceramics. And resulting from these discussions, I'm pleased to announce today that from 2026, next year, State Ceramics will be delivering and providing generous support to the Craft Study Centre, 318 Ceramics and the RCA to continue the Emmanuel Cooper Memorial Lecture Series. For State Ceramics, the Emmanuel Cooper Memorial Lecture is seen as a key annual event that broadens and deepens our understanding of studio ceramics, allows for engagement with issues relevant to the discipline, and provides a forum to discuss ceramics with leading figures in the field. With State Ceramics support, we will be able to continue to attract high-profile speakers, disseminate the lectures more effectively through digital channels, and promote the lecture, and think about ways of developing the conversation that starts here throughout the year. So, on this high note, I will pass over to Julian for tonight's lecture. And I will not give an extensive preamble of Julian's long career, as we're here to hear his words and not my struggling throat. But by way of introduction, Julian has been a key practitioner in the development of the field of studio ceramics in the last 4 decades, with work in major national and international collections. Stair's work addresses ritual, themes of human existence, the parameters of the vessel's scale, the depth of meaning inherent to pots, and he will talk more about these themes in his lecture. So please join me in welcoming Julian Stair for tonight's Emmanuel Cooper Memorial Lecture. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh no, that's good. That's excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashley and Stephen. I'm delighted to be here today this evening and honoured to give this lecture in memory of Emmanuel Cooper. As an artist, potter, writer, editor and activist, Emmanuel was a pivotal figure for many, including me. We were both interested in making pots, but also contextualizing them within wider cultural practice. He commissioned my first article for Ceramic Review in 1995, a review of Colin Pearson exhibition, and we often swapped references. Emmanuel for his biography of Bernard Leach, and me for my PhD, and historiography of critical writing in early studio pottery here at the RCA. His practice of both making and writing about pots is an ongoing inspiration. I've been asked to talk about my work over what is now 5 decades of full-time practice, and perhaps details of my journey may be relevant to any students here tonight, in light of the decisions you will soon be making about how to position yourself amongst your peers and the wider art world once you leave college. I will talk a little bit about materials and processes, but in the main, I will discuss the ideas that have informed and shaped my work. However, I haven't worked in a vacuum, so by default, this talk will also be a commentary on the times and the circumstances I've worked in. As the maxim goes, context is everything. All artists are products of the era that they're born into, and minimalism and conceptual art were the dominant forces when I was a student. I remember the furore over the Tate acquiring Carl Andre's bricks in 1972, admiring the work of American artist Donald Judd and Sol LeWitt, and going to see graduation shows at the Slade, many of which just consisted of A4 sheets of typed text pasted onto the walls. In 1978, I duly produced a BA degree show of abstract sculpture, but I declared at my RCA interview that I was going to drop this work in order to return to my preschool interest in making pots. The sculpture was well received, but for me it had become a cerebral exercise. It didn't have the scope or emotive bandwidth that I felt art should have. At this stage, I was unable to articulate exactly why, but my gut told me that the complexity of pots offered a richer scope for creative expression. Fortunately, I met the brilliant polymath Philip Rawson. Originally brought into the RCA to teach painting, Philip couldn't help himself and chose to also lecture in cultural history and ceramics, as he didn't care about museological taxonomy or hierarchical distinctions of art. His interest was in the central role pottery had played in virtually every era of human culture since clay was first fired 30,000 years ago, arguing that it developed a unique place and connectedness in human culture because of its extraordinary multivalence. That is, the simultaneous ability to address social concerns through a sensorial and unique formal language. After meeting Philip, distinctions between the old and the new, the fine art or crafts, progressive versus traditional, suddenly fell away into insignificance. What is a pot but the articulation of form in space through material? When we encounter a work of art, our response is informed just as much by our own imagination and intuition as by intellect. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger described this encounter as a moment of speechlessness, something that happens in an instant, but later gives way to us making comparisons, categorizing and reflecting. This first gaze is a form of revelation, something he also described as letting the arrival of truth happen, a process that is alive and active through our senses, more hindered than aided by reasoning. And when we're talking about our senses, we're talking about the raw ingredients of sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Sensory experience that provides the building blocks of cognition that then evolve into thoughts and ideas. Interestingly, neurological research is currently expanding our understanding of embodied cognition, suggesting that we have 32 instead of 5 bodily senses, from proprioception, our ability to position our body in space, to a sense of self. Consequently, sensory perception is now regarded as central in shaping consciousness, and crucially, this is not reliant on language. As the artist Agnes Martin wrote of her encounters with art, and I quote, "My interest is in experience that is wordless and silent, and in the fact that this experience can be expressed for me in art, which is also wordless and silent." Staying silent isn't really an option tonight. So before proceeding further to interrogate this idea of connection, I'd like to clarify terminology. Visual art has evolved, as have all the other major forms of human expression, to express ideas that are specific to its inherent nature and terms of reference. That is, the communication of ideas and emotions through visual means, a process that doesn't rely on the framing of the spoken or written word. Simply, is it possible to translate and communicate the colour of a cadmium red, the tone of a human voice, the weight and texture of a pot through words alone? In this third decade of the 21st century, we now find ourselves living in a world where visual art has more often than not become dependent on conceptual rationales. There are many examples today where concepts are offered first and the actual artwork is relegated to a supporting role, a form of material evidence that illustrates a linguistic point. Ceramics is a technical term that describes clay after it is fired. It is not a genre. Clay is a versatile material used to make everything from high-tech cylinder linings to sculpture, body armor, and sanitary ware. But if one looks at the historical record in museums such as the V&A, the vast majority of the 33,000 objects in the ceramic galleries are pots. Not all of these were made to be used. Many are decorative, others display technical virtuosity, some have symbolic value. The crucial question is, does pottery, a genre born at the dawn of human culture, still have a relevance within the current art world? The short answer is yes, of course. If we look at contemporary ceramic work, we have two main forms of practice: pots that define themselves through genre, and ceramics that defines itself through material. My view is that after the formation of academies in the 18th century, all artistic practices were categorized into the fine and the mechanical arts, with the result that ceramics and other genres were downgraded. Fast forward to today, and to become a Royal Academician, one has to be a painter, sculptor, printmaker, or architect. Grayson Perry was admitted as a printmaker, by the way. Where are the photographers such as Martin Parr, weavers such as Ethel Mary, or potters such as Lucy Ree? As a result, many disciplines have been marginalized and lost confidence, and instead looked to contemporary art for validation. If art is really concerned with addressing the most important issues in life, and more importantly, attempting to offer answers, what are the most effective means of doing so? I fundamentally believe pottery has not only been undervalued, but under-theorized, and can offer solutions to some of the most pressing concerns of today, such as the atomization of life through social media. This principle is the basis for everything I've made for the last 40 years or so, irrespective of whether it is a small porcelain cup that fits into one hand or a 2-meter sarcophagi weighing half a ton. I will argue that the multi-modality of ceramics and pottery in particular operates as a radical artistic practice within the theoretical framework and praxis of contemporary art. In actively shaping life through rituals that embody narratives, from the daily to the profound, from breaking bread with family to mediating death, pottery offers an opportunity for a philosophical re-evaluation of how institutions assess and validate contemporary art. I will now talk about a series of exhibitions I made that were conceived to demonstrate the conceptual richness and complexity of pots. The first exhibition is called Quotidian. Quotidian was a conscious response to Nicolas Bourriard's theory of relational aesthetics and the exhibitions it spawned from 2000 to the present that stressed the importance of human relations and their social context. This is a piece of work I made from the 1990s, and I've selected it because it's not so much a photograph of an object, it's a photograph of an action. There's more pieces like this in the current show that Alan has put on at the V&A. I think they're from the 80s at the V&A at the moment. Quotidian was a natural extension of work I had made since the 1980s, but having the support of a gallery such as Kolumba provided a platform that allowed me to fully articulate my central ideas. This is a quote, well, this is the term multivalency, and there's a wonderful quote by John Dewey. So multivalency, having susceptible of many applications, interpretations, meanings, or values. And this is Dewey's quote. Experience signifies active and alert commerce with the world. At its height, it signifies complete interpenetration of self and the world of objects and events. The exhibition reinterpreted the grand dinner services of Wedgwood, Sevres, and Meissen, with over 180 elements on a table measuring 5 by 3 meters. My intention was to try and overcome the paradox of exhibiting pots that are multimodal objects that were originally made to be used, but sadly became ciphers of themselves through the limitations of display in galleries or museums. That is, they become stripped of the very factors that first brought about their existence. When used, pots stimulate our visual perception through sight, auditory sense through hearing, somatosensory sense through touch, and when used for food and drink, our olfactory sense through smell and gustatory sense through taste. As Professor Barry Smith, a philosopher from UCL, who researches the multisensory nature of perceptual experience, argues, the most multisensory experience we can have is something we do every day. It's called lunch. My premise for the exhibition was to highlight the dynamic nature of use through a stop-motion video of a meal using the dinner service and filmed in the gallery. I make pots because they are objects that don't comment on life through detached observation or narrative, but they embody narrative, helping to shape social actions and events in our lives. Contrary to what one might expect, the film is not the artwork. It is an adjunct, supplementary to the pots, made to show the dynamics of use over time. There are no performers. I didn't want the film to be about individuals, so the diners are anonymous. Only their hands and main agents. Only their hands, the main agents in the actions of eating, are visible. You saw the film at the beginning when you came in, so I would just run through it very quickly. Effectively, it's a 3.5-hour meal, which is broken down into about 9 minutes of video. The caterer said the meal would last an hour and a half, and we had to throw people out after 3.5 hours. Quotidian highlighted 2 important traits: the agency and multivalence of pots. And there's a quote here from an anthropologist, Alfred Gell. So agency, a thing or person that acts to produce a particular result. And this is Gell's writing. The immediate other in a social relationship does not have to be another human being. Social agency can be exercised relative to things, and social agency can be exercised by things. And this is incredibly important because this really accounts for the power of objects, that they do not necessarily just rely on us. Of course, we've made them, but they don't necessarily rely on us to be to play a part in our lives. When looking at a cup, one sees a bowl-like form with a void and a handle to grasp, and immediately understands that this is an object to drink from. It suggests a course of action, the fundamental act of drinking. To adapt a Michael Cardew quote, a cup is an artwork that does not carry a message. It is the message. And as Johnny Cash sings in the song Breaking Bread, it's not the barley or the wheat, it's not the oven or the heat that makes this bread so good to eat. It's the kneading and the sharing that makes the meal complete. Familiar and ostensibly simple pots mediate our consumption of food, whether it be a European dinner service, the small dishes of Japanese cuisine, or the first cup of tea in a favoured mug seen through bleary eyes in the morning. To use the term function to describe these experiences is reductive. It creates simple and false binaries, oppositional arguments with an art criticism that ignore the spectrum of complex ideas in between. Our culture has often dismissed pots as inconsequential. The glossy tome Vitamin C, Clay and Ceramic Art alleged in 2017 that, and this is the quote, ceramic art has finally come out of the closet kicking and disentangling itself from domestic servitude and minor art status. But despite its radical claims, I question how transgressive relational practice really is when it is displayed in galleries and museums. Is this just a conventional reaffirmation of the consumption of art through existing institutions that reinforce established hierarchies of patronage and concomitant corporate power? Is the multimodal capacity of ceramics and its ability to exist outside of the white cube actually more inclusive, more subversive? In 2018, I was commissioned to make a baptismal font and altar for St. Augustine's Roman Catholic Church in Hammersmith. I don't have a religious faith, but it was a rare privilege to make a font, a vessel to hold holy water that symbolically marks a new life entering the world and enables baptism, the Christian sacrament of initiation, to take place. The altar too has both a material importance and symbolic role. The Bible is cited on the altar, and it is where the wine and bread are consecrated before the congregation comes forward to symbolically receive the body and blood of Christ for the Eucharist or Mass or communion. I also made a reliquary for the holy relics of St. Constance and St. Secundus from the 1st and 3rd centuries, which I wanted to be as unassuming as possible. Catholic altars are required to contain relics before they can be used for Mass, and it was my responsibility to seal the reliquary inside the altar during the consecration. This was a very stressful moment, and I felt like some sort of medieval craftsman in my apron coming up to serve the church. Even as an atheist, the blessing of the altar was very moving and took over 3 hours with 11 separate phases of music and singing, including incensation, burning incense, anointing with chrism, consecrated oil and balsam, and the Archbishop of Westminster kissing the altar before it was possible to give the First Communion. Fortunately, I was ignorant of the rarity and the significance of making a new Catholic altar. Otherwise, I would have probably been too daunted to take on the commission. But the most overwhelming aspect of the blessing was how one object channeled the collective faith of the priests and the entire congregation, who flocked up to kiss the altar once the ceremony had finished. I've never felt more exposed as an artist. So this is Vincent Nichols, the Archbishop of Cardinal, the Archbishop of Westminster. This was anointing the altar. The man on the left was a bishop from the St. Augustine's order. This was the incensation. And this was giving the first, or preparing the bread and the wine for the First Communion. And talk about audiences. This was the audience, or the congregation. And there were too many people for the church. They were standing outside, they were queuing up, and my God, they hung on every word that was spoken during the whole 3.5 hours. Even as an atheist, the blessing of the altar was very moving and took over 3 hours with 11 separate phases. Have I said that? Yeah. Yep, okay. I have, thank you. This exhibition took 2 years to make and had an 18-month-long tour, taking in 4 completely different venues, from the white cube space of Mima to the archaeological galleries of the National Museum of Wales to Winchester Cathedral and the catacomb-like spaces of Somerset House. One of the central aims of Quietus was to demonstrate what Philip Rawson referred to as the transformative nature of pottery and the symbolic relationship between it and the human body. As a result of attending too many funerals myself, I noticed how important music, poetry, and prose were in helping people come to terms with and accept death. But I also couldn't help noticing the paucity of wood-veneered MDF coffins and the cliched neoclassical urns for cremated ashes, and how little they help to ease our experience of death. This difficulty is a product of a secular world that struggles to address death, perhaps of what the art critic Peter Fuller referred to as the loss of a shared symbolic order. However, having spent so much time over the years in museums looking at pots, I was struck by the quantity and variety of archaic ceramic funerary ware, from cinerary jars to votive ware and sarcophagi made for this final rite of passage. The title Quietus is the Latin term for the moment the soul departs the body, after which life ends. It was my attempt to offer solutions to mediate the fear surrounding death and instead celebrate the lives of those who died by paying tribute to them through material form. This is a wonderful quote by Philip Rawson, and so I think we all understand what materiality is. So Philip wrote, "The primal interweaving of matter, human action, and symbol, something undeniably material, which at the same time contains so much projected into it from man's daily life and experience at all levels that it can seem to him like a projection of his own bodily identity. It thus becomes an external testimony to his existence." And I can't think of a better summary for ceramics than that. In fact, many other objects as well, of course. The metaphor of the vessel as body has been explicit throughout much of ceramic practice. It is clear in the way we use bodily terms to describe the constituent parts of the pot, such as foot, neck, lip, shoulder, belly, and waist. Somatic identity is one of the core themes of the vessel, its ability to hold, paralleling the role of the body as a physical container for what some would call the soul or the human spirit. While pots commonly play a part in sustaining the living body, funerary wear establishes a different set of relationships. On a practical level, it houses and protects the body by containing it in death. But on a symbolic level, cinerary jars and sarcophagi metaphorically represent the idea of the vessel as a body through their role as containers and open new frames of reference that further extend corporal identity. By physically housing the body, it symbolizes funerary wear combines symbol and object, and in the process turns the language of anthropomorphism full circle. The method of making these pots reinforces this theme of transformation. The elemental rhythms of digging clay, using heat to fire pots, parallel the cycles of life and death and practices of burial and cremation. Creation myths repeatedly refer to the forming of the human body from clay, and most burial practices stress the importance of returning the body to the ground from where it originated, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The process of taking the clay from the ground and shaping it into forms and then in turning it back into the ground mirrors the act of inhumation, the archaeological term for burial, prevalent in so many cultures. The firing of different clays or bodies, a term we commonly use in ceramics, is achieved through exposure to extreme heat, which alters the nature of clay through chemical change into a permanent and fixed material. Again, this alchemical transformation of clay mirrors the rituals and processes of cremation, where the human body is transformed through fire after death. The final piece in the exhibition was a memorial to a relative, Leslie James Cox, entitled Reliquary for a Common Man. I wanted Leslie to be an everyman for the exhibition, to represent how all the works in the show could be used for different people. This was the first time I used audio-visual elements. I did so in order to reveal the person behind the memorial to those who didn't know him. I animated Leslie through old Super 8 films and showed the progression of his life through family photographs and broadcast his voice in the gallery through an oral history interview. So this is the photograph of the fourth gallery at Mima, and there's just one object, and then the plinth I made. And then this is, I think, about 50 seconds long. This is a film we made of Leslie from old Super 8 movies that we obviously all knew him, but this was a way of kind of bridging the gap between those who didn't and the idea and exhibiting of him in the exhibition. He was, of course, a truly lovely man. And then I gathered up photographs. Oh, I've gone too far, so excuse me. I collected photographs of Leslie from a young boy to an old man just before he died. And by the way, that's my daughter. That's my oldest daughter, who Leslie and Rose were very close. And then and this is an oral history interview of his life conducted by the Socialist Party of Great Britain. The final, All memorials memorialize, but most do so by referring to the person they commemorate in the abstract. Think of an equestrian sculpture in Whitehall or the impressive memorial to the victims of 9/11 in New York. With Leslie, I wanted to unite the themes of the show, materiality, anthropomorphism, and transformation. So I made his memorial from his own cremated ash, with the agreement of the family, who felt it was exactly the kind of thing that Leslie would have supported. As you know, ceramic ingredients are composites of different chemicals, and after cremation, the human body is reduced to ash, consisting of chemicals such as calcium oxide, phosphate, and magnesium oxide. After receiving Leslie's ashes back from the crematorium, I ground them down further and mixed them with other materials needed to make a bone china clay, and then through his cinerary jar to hold the remaining ash. I'm assuming everyone here knows that bone china is partially made from bone ash or calcined bone ash. Leslie's jar has a simple job of holding his ashes, but the extraordinary possibilities of pottery allow for much more. He is literally embodied in his own cinerary jar. This jar of human bone china is a physical, metaphorical, and social locus. It was made for him, it is him, it is still possible to reach out your hand and touch him. Subject and representation become united. Idea transforms into material. Material transforms into construct. Construct becomes tangible. And returning to Kaju's quote, this work does not carry a message, it is the message. Equivalence is a show from 218. I've spoken a lot about agency and material in different contexts that may create the impression I'm only interested in relational issues. Objects are ideas made material, and of course the form and resolution of these objects is crucial in delivering ideas successfully. I try and achieve a clarity of form in my work, but not a mechanical perfection, allowing a legacy of movement and process to remain as visible evidence of the hand. So I'll briefly talk about the exhibition Equivalence at Corby Moore in 218, where form and sculptural concerns took precedence. I made and presented 5 familiar domestic objects: a demitasse, a jug, a cup, and a circular and faceted beaker, sited on wall-mounted grounds, made to specific dimensions to articulate the work for display. I also made 5 equivalent forms, scaled up to the point where in practical terms they became useless, the result being 5 large sculptures that sat on the floor of an archetypal white cube gallery. I titled the exhibition Equivalence, as I was posing a question to visitors who are in the main more familiar with fine art conventions than ceramics. If they accepted the larger scale work as sculpture, what were the smaller objects? As equivalent objects of matching form but smaller size, could they also be considered sculpture and qualify as art? Or would Gavin Turk's remark, as soon as an object becomes useless, it becomes useful, hold strong and disqualify them? Scale has a huge impact on how we read form, as it doesn't always successfully translate from one size to another. Even as the artist who made these larger-than-life's work, their otherworldly size was disorientating, challenging my deep knowledge of these objects I knew so well. Irrespective of differences in scale, the exhibition confirmed one thing for me, that even if one could acknowledge the smaller works as sculpture, their sensory and experiential richness opened up additional complexities that far exceeded the scope of the larger and purely sculptural work. One only has to think of Hans Koper, seeing one of his stittle forms full of brilliant red tulips and his Cycladic pots holding fine strands of grass in Lucy Ree's living room, as I did on a number of occasions. That was an epiphany. The agency of these sculptural pots opened up additional meanings, becoming active as opposed to passive artworks. The shock of the pandemic prompted me to re-examine the work I'd done in Quietus after a break of 10 years. Like many people in the spring of 2020, I was trying to comprehend the enormity of the unfolding pandemic, and 5 years later, we now know that over 230,000 people died in the UK and 7 million globally. There was much discussion at the time how the arts would respond, but apart from the painted hearts on the Embankment National COVID Memorial by the guerrilla actions of Led by Donkeys and COVID Families for Justice, there was precious little response. I made a new body of work over 2 years in response to the pandemic and exhibited it at the Sainsbury Centre in 23 with a selection of art from their collection. They have a magnificent collection of antiquarian and modernist art, with a geographical spread across all continents and reaching back to the 4th century millennium BCE. I selected 50 objects ranging from a German pot to Cycladic sculptures, a Byzantine reliquary and a Giacometti drawing. I felt these objects were material strategies, offering solutions from other cultures on how to address death and that we could learn from. I also included a Kagano pot by Magdalena Lodundo and a painting by Imran Qureshi as contemporary artists who made memorial work. I built on the last 2 pieces I had made in Quietus, creating more explicit renderings of the human body, and also Leslie's human bone china cinerary jar. The work in the show ranged from the domestic to the monumental, as I wanted to include jars with a visceral scale of full-size figures. I referred to Albrecht Dürer's 4 books on human proportion. So these are just in, this is a second installation shot of the exhibition, and you can see that there's a mix of objects. So on the left you have an English Gothic jug, which I think is, I've always felt has been, as a kind of wonderful anthropomorphic form. You have an Ivory Coast spoon, again in the form of a stylized figure, and on the right you have a memorial figure from Sulawesi, which is in Indonesia. And then this is a further collection of objects from the centre. While working through the morphologies that Dürer presented, I realized there was a correlation between distinct parts of our bodies and archetypal ceramic form, and made a series of somatic jars that reinforce these elements, such as the torso, shoulder, neck, waist, and legs. I grouped these pieces together as a family and repeated some of these forms for the commemorative cinerary jars. Contemporary art is very good at highlighting difficult societal issues, but I wanted to try and offer solutions by grounding this exhibition in the body politic of the pandemic. 9 months before the opening, the Eastern Daily Press invited people to come forward if they wished to become involved in the project, and 7 local families who had recently suffered bereavement contacted me, and after meeting supervised by a local cruise counsellor, we invited them to collaborate and arranged a series of workshops. I felt it was important to situate the bereaved directly in the exhibition and give voice to their grief caused by the death of their relatives. With the agreement, I made commemorative human bone china cinerary jars for their dead. As with reliquary for a common man, these would have been embodied with a cremated ash and then gifted to the families at the end of the exhibition. The relatives talked to me about their family members through a series of conversations, describing their character and appearance. This is the quiet room where the family's panels were displayed. It was translucent, so it was partially screened off, but still kind of part of the exhibition. Oh, and this is a very nice quote by Danny Miller. You don't need me to read that out. Laurie was trim for his age, had grey hair and good shoulders, physical attributes described by his widow, that I translated into the colour and form of his jar. Alan was a glazier and coincidentally had worked on the centre when it was built 45 years earlier, and so his was the only jar I glazed. We screened off a section of the gallery as a quiet area for the families and visitors to sit and reflect. This also proved to be an important space for many visitors who volunteered stories about their friends and relatives who had also died in the pandemic. And this is one of the panels. I never met them, but for some strange reason, I kind of felt an affinity with Susan. This may all sound very serious and grim, but the opposite was true. My overriding memory of time spent with the families was laughter. The centre and I had taken precautions to ensure their emotional well-being, but the relief of being able to talk openly about their relatives proved to be liberating. The philosopher Simon Critchley describes death as the last great taboo. And as a culture, we are nervous of death and uncomfortable talking about it openly, thus compounding the problem for the bereaved. The sheer need of the families to talk about their relatives was palpable and counterintuitively life-affirming, and subsequently they brought their friends to see their cinerary jars. I believe our secular rites of passage for marking death are not fit for purpose, but this is where art has excelled in the past and could continue to do so today if artists were prepared to get involved. In an increasingly atomised world, I believe the corporal identity of pots can remind us of what it is to be human. I will end with a quote from the German-Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han, who said in an interview in 2021, and this is the quote, "Today we are in transition from the age of objects to the age of non-objects. I refer to objects as resting places for life because they stabilise human life. The same chair and the same table, in their sameness, lend the fickle human life some stability and continuity. We can linger with objects. With information, however, we cannot." I haven't talked much about making or materials or one thing and another, so this is just a couple of screens from making work for Art, Death and the Afterlife. So they're thrown, cored and thrown, and this is what I spend months doing in brick factories. And as you know, you can only throw the rim of a pot, so as the pots get taller, I have to move up with them on a scaffolding ladder, a scaffolding tower. And then this is this is the very last part of throwing one of those jars you just saw. By far and away, they are the most difficult things I've ever made, even including those huge sarcophagi which took 8 months to dry. Thank you very much. Just to close, Yale, I don't make any money from this, Yale do. Yale very kindly, or whatever the word is, published a monograph on my work in May, and they knew about the talk tonight, so they said that if people wanted to take down the code, you can buy the book for 25% discount. So feel free to photograph it. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you so much, Julian, for that lecture. And we're very honoured to listen to such a wonderful talk and see such wonderful work. I've got a mic here and a roving mic. I wonder if I could pass this over to one of the very kind student volunteers. So Julian has very kindly given over some time to answer any questions from the audience. So I'm just going to stand here, I think, while I trip over things. Oh, we already have one, so that's good. Thank you.
Can you repeat the name of the German philosopher that you ended the lecture with?
Byun, B-Y-U-N hyphen Chun. Hang on. I'm dyslexic. B-Y-U-N-G hyphen capital C-H-U-L and third word Han, H-A-N. He writes really well about the atomization of contemporary life and is very critical of the impact that digital, the digital and in particular social media, which is run by corporate, all the kind of corporate, powers that we know, kind of separate and break down bonds of community. And he's someone who's really worthwhile reading, and he publishes nice small books, so they're bite-sized chunks.
Thank you. There's a question right at the back.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. I know that you have fairly recently done a residency in Japan, and I wonder whether you had any particular discussions about the work you've done with funerary wares there, and if so, what context you might bring from that angle.
Thank you, that's a good question. One thing over the years, I have studied many different cultures' funerary practices, and it's mind-bogglingly complicated and interesting. So in Japan, they cremate the body after death, but they don't grind it down. I think we grind it down to make it look palatable so that it's not kind of, upsetting bones, and it comes out as a kind of a sand, here in Britain. But they store the bones, and they actually have special chopsticks for occasions when the family will visit the dead relative, and those chopsticks are very particular to, and used when they pay their respect. I think they're a little surprised at the way I actually incorporated ash into the pots. In fact, in Europe, they're quite surprised as well. And there's very particular rules in every country. I did research way back, and the restrictions in Britain are about the Human Tissue Act, which is handling human tissue, before cremation, when it's kind of organic, as opposed to just being reduced to straight kind of chemical consistency. They do also make cinerary jars. I like the term cinerary jar because it's the archaeological term instead of funerary urn or whatever. So there are many kind of shared similarities between cultural practice here in the UK and other cultures, and that does include Japan. I think this will sound terribly nationalistic, but I think there's a level of interrogation around theoretical ceramic, craft, material art in Britain that isn't always matched elsewhere. So I think for them, But then there's the limitations of language, so it's very difficult to be able to kind of read people's responses. Anyway, they found it a little difficult that I was making funerary-ware scenery jars.
I can come up.
Hello. I was curious, your colour palette seems really distinct, and your choices of when to use colour, well, there seems to be a choice when you're using colour or not. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about colour.
When I was a student, I did use all sorts of industrial colours and pigments, but I find them a bit kind of sterile. And I've made the decision to use straight oxides. I think colour really reveals itself through context. Hoffman's kind of homage to the square and things like that. So natural materials, oxides, they have a life. There's a kind of an extra level of interest. They're not kind of flat and consistent. So as I say, I limit myself to those colours. Because one day I kind of thought, my goodness, you know, there's all these pots throughout history that up until the Ming Dynasty, when enamels, Anglaise enamels were developed, and then for the first time you did have brighter reds and yellows and, you know, more kind of primary colours. All of these amazing pots in history were made with exactly the same materials and clays and oxides. And they would juxtapose one colour against another colour to make those colours really sing. And I thought that was a pretty good lesson in life that we could learn from. So my brightest colour is an iron red, but I get a variety of different reds depending on the clays I use. I collect and have many clays. And I would juxtapose a warm with a cool, you know, a light with a dark, you know, to try and get as much of an interest as possible. So I use natural clays. I do also make my own clays. So I have over 100 different porcelain colours. So when I make some of my groups, which featured particularly in quotidian, then those are a mixture of fine porcelains through to very impure, unrefined clays. I hope that answers the question.
You said the embodied pieces that you did for Sainsbury Centre were the most difficult things you'd ever done. What went wrong? I mean, what can go wrong? I mean, do you have sort of disasters in the studio, or just that level of care that has to be taken is arduous?
They were so difficult. I really wanted to keep to the proportions of the human figure, and that's very much about having a narrow ankle. And so the size of the ankle of the pieces was tiny, and for this to support the weight and the whole of the form above it. So that did present particular problems, but then you just work your way through the problems and you find a solution. My philosophy of making is to keep everything really simple and direct. Just understand the materials you're working with, their nature, their character, work within that character. If you push it too hard one way or the other, it will come back and bite you. But if you actually listen, metaphorically speaking, to the clay, it's extraordinary. It will do almost whatever you want.
It's a lot of cling film.
Well, that's to keep everything the same consistency, because it would take, if I did a normal kind of working day, it would take about a month to make each piece, but I concentrate that down into a much shorter period of time by keeping the moisture in the parts that I've thrown.
I just wanted to ask about the jars. To what extent do you see them as a permanent repository for the ashes, or as a method of conveying ashes to a permanent place of interment? And to what extent does that, how does that factor into how you view them and what they mean?
Not every jar is embodied, and they're pots. They're lids. They're lidded pots. And that's their job, is to kind of hold things. Roman funerary jars are rather lovely because they reuse cooking pots. So, if Aunt, Lydia died or whatever, they take down the flour jar, throw the flour away, whatever, and then put her cremated ashes in there. So I just work within the kind of absolutely direct line of what pots do and how they perform and how they've worked over the centuries. The embodied pots, those, that's a question of working with someone and then obviously getting ash from their relative.
Yeah.
So sadly, I've just finished making an embodied jar for a friend of mine who's a terribly sad story. And it's very intense when I'm making them. It's very intense because I know the significance that it has to the people I'm making them for. So not everything I do is necessarily revolves around death.
But sort of beyond the ones where you're using the human ash to actually make the vessel, sometimes people are wanting. A lot of those kind of funerary urns are about collecting the ash and taking it to a grave somewhere that you will deposit it, and then So what's the how do you think as a society do you think we should be keeping? What does it give people to have that permanent repository versus using your having something to make a meaningful process of taking ashes to a final resting place?
The embodied ones do exactly that.
Yeah.
You can use them. Shock horror.
Yeah.
The only thing is, and this is what it's just about trying to capitalize and utilize sensory experience to the maximum.
Yeah.
And all I can say is extremely meaningful to people to be able to touch the jar and actually touch, in part, the person who's died and who means a lot. So it's as I said, it's kind of trying to turn a symbol back into something tangible and real.
Thank you. Just building on that, I'm interested in, I'm very struck by the way that these material processes can support a processing of emotions in the grieving process. And I've been watching with interest and occasionally amusement or dismay how there's a kind of growing industry, perhaps more in the US than in the UK, although I think it's beginning to be imported here. And I'm kind of interested in the way in which people are seeking to turn ashes into ceramic objects that can be held. So there's a few different startups in the States that are actually turning this into something of an industry. I feel a little bit strange about that because I'm interested in craft processes rather than a kind of depersonalized, although perhaps more accessible industrial process.
No, people, you can turn ash into diamonds, you can have ash put into fireworks and explode them they fire them into the air and explode them in the sky. I don't think one can kind of, approve or condemn it, outright. For example, undertakers have been doing the same thing, but in different ways, for many years. But corporate life always looks for ways to make money and to kind of capitalize on, any new ideas. I certainly don't do this as a kind of money making exercise. It's for me, making work is trying to kind of capitalize on what I think are these extraordinary kind of important traits that pots have, and it's a marriage between trying to make good art, but that has this kind of social connection as well. So it's a question of trying to balance a variety of different needs.
And thank you for responding to my stumbling, halting towards the question. I think I'd like to say thank you for drawing attention to this aspect of craft practice. I know from talking to people who teach ceramics, when I've sidled up to them and asked them questions because I discovered that you could incorporate ashes into ceramics, I've had a few tutors say, yes, every couple of years I have a student who asks me about this, and I think it's something that draws a lot of people in, but we don't talk about very much. And thank you for making it more visible. Sorry, that wasn't really a question, but thank you.
Well, the great Dora Billington, she made her own scenery jar, but obviously she couldn't incorporate her own ash in while she was making it.
I just had a question about what you mentioned earlier in the lecture about sensorial education and the kind of lack of it maybe in our current age, or that it's sort of under challenge or threatened in some way, and that your work really kind of tries to evoke all the senses or some of the senses through the materiality of clay. My question is more like how reliant are you on time, basically, to experience this kind of expanded sensorial mode? Because the examples you gave earlier were a congregation, and then the other one was the dinner party, both of 3 hours duration. I wonder kind of what you think about kind of the shorter time that most people have to reflect or contemplate ceramics, or even be in a gallery, and whether you think that has any bearing on the kind of affect of a piece of yours or others. So how dependent are we on time, and what can we do about not having enough of it?
Well, one line I said, this, my interest in making pots is applied to everything I've made since I stopped making purely sculptural work. Whether it be a small porcelain cup that you pick up in one hand, or half-a-ton sarcophagus. I just think ceramics is such an extraordinary genre. Pots are such an extraordinary genre that offer so much. There's so many different avenues that you can explore, and I just personally intrigued by this multifaceted, multivalent sensorial experience that they offer. But of course, there's something it's very different. Making the jug took a lot less time than making one of those huge sarcophagi, and it has occupies a different place in life. So it's just this amazing, adaptable genre that can operate in so many areas of life. I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
Yeah, it's more like perhaps for the audiences, like seeing your work, whether there is any need to sort of spend a long time with them to get their full effect, or whether there are kind of basically, does it need, do the works work best within ritual that demand a lot of time, or do you feel as if they lose something by being in an art gallery that you're giving over to the audience, how long they spend there?
Way back in the 90s, I did Chelsea Craft Fair, and I was making Well, originally I made kind of unique individual one-off pieces, and then I felt I really needed to address this idea of use and kind of commit to it properly to understand it, and lost money because it was much more profitable to make individual kind of artworks. Anyway, at Chelsea, I was showing tableware, and I don't like the term tableware, but I was showing pots that one could use on a daily basis, and I made a sign saying, "Please touch." And people came up and they would kind of, if they were interested, they'd come up and they'd look, their hands would reach out, they'd see the sign, and then they'd go, "Oh, sorry." And then I'd say, "No, just read the sign again." So this notion of access, if you like, if that's a way of paraphrasing what you're saying, it can be instant, very short-lived, or it can reveal itself over time. And I used to make porcelain dinner plates, and I made them very thick and heavy because porcelain is just incredibly strong clay. It was a kind of counter to this fineness and delicacy of porcelain. So they were thick, but they were incredibly strong. And people sometimes would go, "Oh, these plates are a bit heavy." But then after they'd used them for a month or so, or however long, they'd go, I quite like the weight. So, as you say, one has to kind of experience things to kind of understand them fully, but they do reveal themselves over different time spans as well.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. Other questions? Yes. There's a microphone just coming.
Julian, that was great. Thank you very much. I suppose it follows on from the last question, is that I'm a photographer part-time, but when I let my images out and to let them loose into an audience, I lose control over what it means to them. So, and when an audience then looks at the art, they'll interpret it based on context and how they see it. Do you feel it's the same with ceramics?
Yeah, but I like that. I think there's an anarchic element. Art is really made by its appreciation and by people engaging with it. And I think it's great when you have to let go of it and it's not, on the plinth or in the exhibition or whatever. And then people use it in their own way. They make their own combinations. They'll do things with it that you wouldn't necessarily thought of. And for me, I think that's a really positive thing. Of course, I'm a bit of a control freak, as you might have kind of realised. But nevertheless, I think the idea of actually letting go of things and then they have a new life is something really positive. And that notion of the object being used in different ways. You can't think of every way an object would be used. So I don't mind that. I do make groups of pots, and I will select groups that I think work well in terms of form and colour and shape and one thing and another size. The great Australian potter who did the Morandi still lives, Gwyn Hanson Piggott, she would make a template with the exact position that you had to put the work in when you bought it. And lo and behold, woe betide you if you deviated from her norm. So people say to me, can I change them around? And I say, of course you can. You can do whatever you like with it. It's great because then they're kind of taking possession and they're metaphorically speaking, they're buying into the work. So, yes, of course, it's nice when people respectful, but actually it's also really good when it takes off its own life. The quotidian, the dinner service, you saw the kind of millimetre-like precision that I laid everything out with. It was all measured to the mil. And the laying of the dinner service at the beginning, kind of revealed that. By the end of the meal, that precision had just totally fallen apart. And it was messy and anarchic. And that's what we humans do. And I think it's really great, when there are different lives and different kind of takes on art.
We have time for one more question, if there is one, from the audience. Want to kind of...
Can I ask one?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, Julie, thank you. Quietus toured, and I wondered what your thoughts were on what the exhibition brought to the venues that it was exhibiting in, and vice versa, what that dialogue was like. Did you have a leaning towards one of those particular venues?
I wanted very different venues to bring out, to kind of show the work in, to create contrast. So Mima, was 3,000 square feet of incredible kind of white cube space, and in a way, those spaces are the modern cathedrals of life. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Everything else won't be able to live up to this. But actually, when it went to Wales, and I was working with the archaeologists, and I was bringing in the pots from their collection and taking my work into the archaeological galleries, that was equally exciting, but in another way. And I thought, I can't possibly kind of top that. At Winchester Cathedral, oh my God, the privilege of being able to show there, that was amazing, especially because everyone thought I'd made the show in particular for Winchester because the colours matched the cathedral perfectly. And then I thought, okay, well, I'll never be able to top, a kind of 1,000-year-old cathedral. But then the Dead House in Somerset House, kind of more catacombs-like than catacombs, was so theatrical. So each venue worked in its own way incredibly well. And it's the kind of collective, the collective impact that all had.
Thank you. Thanks for all the wonderful questions. I think we can all agree that we had a really big treat this evening to hear your lecture, and particularly what you were saying about relational aesthetics. I've always thought that should be more applied to surroundings, where often it's kind of as an idea talked about in other art forms, but never about surroundings, where it applies perhaps most greatly. So there's lots of wonderful things that I hope you've all taken from the lecture. But it just leaves me to say a big thank you to Julian, and if you'd like to join me in an applause. Do come to the 2026 Emmanuel Cooper lecture.
Thank you very much.